My name is Anna Boyer. I'm a designer advocate at Figma. Basically, everyone on my team has a background in design. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of using my experience having been a designer to help you guys in just learning design, learning how to best use Figma in your workflows, things like that. So now that we've kind of got the intros done with, I'm going to hop into the file that I have. Again, please try and duplicate a copy of that. But quickly, I just want to share, if you want to have any additional learnings just around advanced prototyping, I've put in some links to some different resources that we already have out there. So there's the advanced prototyping playground file. There's also the variables playground file. Because prototyping is powered by variables, it's definitely useful to have some context on variables. We do a little bit in the prototyping playground file, but if you want more information, definitely check out the variables one. I also have a link to the Advanced Prototyping Help Center. So all of the Help Center articles to kind of break down how to do things are there. And then also from Config, we had a presentation given by the prototyping team just around, what's been launching and what is Figma's vision for prototyping. There's also a deep dive with a corresponding file, I believe, from Miggy's profile that also kind of talks through, okay, what are all the basic concepts and gives you kind of step-by-step instructions on how to build some examples. And there's also this other supplementary prototyping with variables YouTube video. So yeah, this is kind of like just a different way to approach learning advanced prototyping. I'll still be covering the basics, but if you feel like you kind of need some things in a different format or are still struggling to grasp any of the concepts, definitely visit these resources. And then I also wanted to quickly talk over some useful keyboard shortcuts that I find personally really helpful when it comes to building prototypes. So first of all, as you're building your prototypes, you're probably going to be switching between the design and prototyping panels a lot. So if you want to do that really quickly, to switch the prototype panel, you can just do option 9. And to switch the design panel, you can do option 8. Alternatively, if you just want to keep switching between the two, you just do Shift E, and you can kind of see my little side panel here. It's going to make that switch. If you want to deep select things, so if you're trying to assign a variable to a particular element in your design, deep selecting is really helpful. So hold down the Command key and click on that layer. Let's switch back to design mode, and you'll be able to select that particular layer. If you're trying to select a nested text element, such as if you're trying to assign a string variable to a piece of text, you can also hit T on your keyboard, and that will also automatically select the text layer. And then when you want to present your prototypes, the keyboard shortcut for that is Option Command Enter. And that will basically open up a separate prototyping tab. And then, of course, we also have our new preview, which allows you to preview a prototype on your canvas. So Shift Space, you can see it's pulled up this little preview, and I can resize it. And basically, whatever I resize that to is going to be essentially the configuration that I have whenever I'm previewing any other frames in my file. So yeah, I'll be using a lot of these shortcuts as I go through, and that's kind of what allows me to be really fast when prototyping. And yeah, with that said, let's kind of jump into going over some of the basic concepts of advanced prototyping, and then we'll go step by step through how to build a single e-commerce experience with that. So these slides are directly taken from the advanced prototyping playground file. But just as context, so variables are what power advanced prototyping. Variables essentially allow you to store information in your designs, and by using prototyping interactions to make changes to those variables and by binding elements of your design to variables, you're able to create prototypes that have logic and are able to create essentially screens that can dynamically update based on your variables. So in the example that we're building today, which is e-commerce, where you're adding elements to a cart and then seeing those items at the checkout, that's a really classic example of a prototype where you would have had to essentially create a lot of duplicate screens with minor differences between them in order to essentially allow users for your prototype to be able to go through every possible permutation. But in using variables and allowing you to create prototypes with logic, it significantly reduces the number of frames that you'll need to create. All right. So one of the new things that I've launched with advanced prototyping is the set variable action. So by using the set variable, you're essentially allowed to have a prototyping interaction make a change to a variable. I'm going to kind of breeze through these basic examples also because I'll just talk about them a lot more as we're building our prototype together. And then when you have the set variable, there's probably some other things that maybe you want to do with your variable. Maybe for like a number value, you want to convert that, or you want to add 1 to it every time you click on a button, or maybe you have like some text and you want to add some additional value to it. These are called expressions. So essentially expressions allow you to make changes to your variable. In the case of number variables, you can use a bunch of different number operations, such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. For strings, you can add an additional text to something. So that is what you can do with the string variables. And then for Booleans, you can have them where if a statement returns true or false, you can have that set the Boolean variable to true or false. But we'll be showing a lot of these in our prototype as we're building it. And then if you want certain things to occur in your prototype, if certain conditions are met, that is where conditionals come in. So they're also a new kind of action like set variable. And essentially they take the format of if then. So if a certain requirement is fulfilled, then perform this action, otherwise perform this alternate action. And yeah, we'll be seeing how that works in our prototype. And then we also have this concept of modes. So modes are essentially a way to group your variables. In the example that we're going to be building today, we have some different types of product items. We've got like watermelon, pears, radishes, and cherries, and they all share a lot of like key variables, right? So for each of them, we want to have the specific price. We want to keep track of how many of each item is being added to the cart. And then we also maybe want to keep track of like if that item should be visible in the cart screen. And so in this case, we're able to use modes as a way to keep track for each individual item instead of having to create a totally separate variable for every single one, because it feels like it's very duplicative work. So modes really help reduce the number of variables that you need to create. But another great thing about them is it allows you to reuse prototyping interactions. Essentially, if you create a prototyping interaction that were to update something like price, if you nest that in a frame that has the mode watermelon, then it knows to only update the variable for that particular mode. And we'll see that in action later in our prototype. And then last thing I wanted to quickly give overview on is multiple actions. So in Figma now you're able to add as many actions as you want to any prototyping interaction. You probably experienced the struggle with interactive components where you already have a change to action switching between different variants, but maybe you wanted that to also cause another change in your design. I know for me personally, I had to do a lot of things where I'm using like on mouse up or while pressing as sort of a workaround. But now you can basically add as many actions as you want to any interaction. So if we look here at this interactive component that we have, we already have the connection between these two. And then if I wanted to add any additional action, you just click the plus button here, add action, and you can choose whichever ones you want to use. So yeah, that's how multiple actions works. Okay, so that's kind of everything I wanted to quickly cover as a quick overview, but we'll definitely be going a lot more in depth into these and seeing how we actually can use these in practice as we're going through building out our prototyping example. So this is just a quick little visual of the prototype we're building. So we're going to have it where if there's no items added to a cart, you have an empty state, and then you can keep adding individual items to your basket, update that basket icon, and then you'll be able to see those corresponding items and their values in the basket screen. So this is just a quick summary of the kind of prototype we'll be building today. You'll see when we look down here, this is kind of your building space in this section. So I already have the 2 core screens built out. So for this entire experience, we basically just need these 2 screens, one to show the product listings and one for that basket experience. And then we already have some different components set up here. So we've got some components for the different images, a component for the product card, a button component to interact with the items of the card, a cart card, and then a basket icon. So all of these are, everything you need is essentially already created. We're just going to be focusing on essentially building the prototyping interactions and setting up our transitions to create this prototype. So when you're going through building an advanced prototype, I think the first step is to essentially think about what do you want to have in your prototype. So think through what are all the things I want users to be able to do. And the concept of this prototype, I listed out for the basket screen. We want users to know the total cost. So we want users to be able to see the total cost based on the number of items and which items were added. I want them to be able to see as well the total number of items that are in their basket. And then we also want to show an empty state for if any items have been added to the basket or not. So for that, we know that we're able to set up some variables. Once you've essentially defined the things that you want users to be able to do or see, that allows you to figure out what variables you need to set up. So in this case, for the total cost, we're going to create a number variable called total. For cart count, that is a number variable that's set up so we can keep track of the total number of items in the cart. And then the isEmpty is a Boolean variable that we're using to essentially determine, okay, should we show the empty state or not? In the context of prototyping, Boolean variables are going to be used for layer visibility. So we'll connect that to our empty state later. You can see the variables that I've already set up. If you go to the design panel and make sure you're not selecting anything, so just click somewhere on the canvas. You can go to local variables and you'll see here under general checkout, we already have our different variables set up there. Okay, so we've kind of figured out what we want for the basket screen, but now let's think about the product screen. So for that, we want to show, first of all, each individual product's details, so information such as its name and its price. We also want to show the number of items of each product that has been added to the basket. So being able to keep track of each individual one's number of items. And then we also want to keep track of whether or not that item should be visible in the basket screen, right? So it doesn't really make sense to have, radishes show up in the basket screen if none of them have been added. We only want the ones that have explicitly been added to the basket to appear. So that has helped me inform which variables we need to set up. So we've got name and price, which are each individual item's details. That is a string and a number variable. We've got item count, which is a number variable to keep track of each individual item's number that have been added to the cart. And then that will also be used to calculate things such as the total cost. And then we've also got another Boolean here, which will be tied to each corresponding item's like basket card, essentially for its visibility. And then for these, we have grouped them into our different modes. So that way we don't have to repeat and create essentially 16 variables. We can just create 4 and then have our different modes. So now that we have all of our variables and modes set up, and that has all been figured out in breaking down essentially what we want users to see and what we want our prototype to allow users to do, it's time to start connecting those to our components. So let's start out by just connecting some things. So here we have our product card. And the first step for that is I want to first connect the product details to my variables I have set up. So to connect the name first, let's command and click in here. You'll see there's a little variables icon at the side here. That essentially allows you to know whether or not you can bind a particular element of your design to a variable. So I'm going to click apply variable and we'll choose name. And then I'll also click into this particular text layer here where I want to display the price and connect that to price. Let's also make my UI a little bit bigger so you guys can see it better. Okay, so I've connected these things and let's do the same exact thing for the cart card. So click on the text layer. Let's connect that to the name. And let's connect this one to item count, because I want to display the number for each in here. And then this one will be connected to price. And you can see this gone ahead and updated to show $3.99. Okay, so I've connected for the cards. Looks like for the button here, we also want to display item count. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll select on the particular text layer and choose item count. And for this basket icon as well, we want to connect this to show the total number of items added to the basket. So I'm clicking on this text layer and let's select cart count. Okay, so I've connected my variables to my components and I already have instances of all of my components nested in these screens. Maybe let's unclip this content so that we can actually see everything. And now I want to update each card to correspond to each individual item. To do that, I need to essentially assign the mode to each of these cards. I already have them connected to the variables. So we'll select the first one. And if you click on this little change variable mode, that's in the layers portion of the design panel, go to products, and then we'll use watermelon. Nothing's changed because the default is watermelon because it's the first one, but let's move on to the second one and do the same thing. So click change variable mode and let's make this one pairs. And you'll notice that immediately the text and the price have updated to match the particular variable values for that mode. I also have these images set up as a nested instance swap. In the future, ideally, we'll be able to have these images also connected to the variables, but because it is a nested component instance, you cannot assign a nested component instance to a variable yet. That is definitely feedback that the team is working on. But in the meantime, I basically just made this a component, nested as an instance swap. And so we'll make sure to let's go ahead and bubble this up so I can make that change. So let's click on product card, add a property, and let's expose that image so we can easily change it. So let's select here, and for image, we'll switch this one to pairs to match the mode that we have. All right, let's keep going. Let's make this one cherries, switch the image to cherries. And last one is radishes, and we'll make that a radishes image. Cool. So I've now connected each of these cards to the corresponding mode, and you can see it's updated the information to reflect the correct price and name for each of these. I'm going to do the exact same thing now for each of the cards in the basket. So let's also make sure to bubble up the image property. I believe it's already added. Great. So we'll do that real quick. Watermelon. Pears. Pears. And radishes is the last one. Okay. All right, so we've finished connecting our variables to our components. We've gone ahead and assigned a mode to our component instances to make sure that every single product is reflected in our designs. And now the next step is to start creating interactions. So at the highest level, we want users to be able to navigate between our two screens. So for that, I'm going to just create a prototyping interaction where I just want, when I click on the basket icon, to navigate to the basket screen. When I click the close icon, navigate back from basket to products. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. And then now let's start creating some prototyping interactions so we can really add logic to our prototype. So the primary format in which users are going to be interacting with this prototype will be in interacting with these buttons that we have in each of these cards here. As I said before, a great advantage to using modes in your prototypes is that it will allow you to reuse prototyping interactions. So the first thing that we want users to do when they click on this button is when they click on the plus side, we want them to add items. And then when they click on the minus, we want them to subtract. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click on the plus portion. Let's add an interaction. And we're going to make this a set variable. Basically, what we want to do is when you click on the plus, we want to increase the item count. So the count for each for that particular card's item. And we want to increase it by 1. When clicking on the minus button, though, we don't want users to be able to go below 0 because that doesn't really make sense. It should be from 0 to whatever infinite positive number. So what I'm going to do in this case is rather than just doing a set variable item count to -1, we're going to create a conditional. And my conditional is going to be if item count is greater than 0, then we'll set item count to item count -1. When you're also creating your interactions, you can type things freely. You can choose from the options that you have in the dropdown. It's really up to you. So we'll make this a set variable. So otherwise, we'll set variable item count. You also see what I'm typing in. It's going to narrow down my options. And when I'm seeing the option that I want, I can also just click enter. Enter, and it'll automatically populate that. So that's kind of how I'm able to write my interactions this quickly. So we'll set that to 0. So basically we're saying if it's greater than 0, go ahead and subtract 1. Otherwise, set it to 0. So basically I'm setting 0 as the minimum possible value for this. And then this +1 and -1, these are all, as we talked about before, expressions. So we're using numerical operations in an expression in order to influence our number variable item count. And as I said before, with modes, you're able to reuse prototyping interactions. So in this case, when we're clicking on the plus and minus button, we're making changes to the item count variable. But item count variable isn't specific to one particular item. It's just a variable, and then we have our different modes for each product. But because this component is nested in our product card, and for our product card instances, we already went through that process of assigning assigning its different modes. So with any of the interactions that are nested in this button component, it's going to know that I would like to add one to watermelon's item count. I want to add one to pears item count, etc. So if we preview this prototype real quick, let's make this a little bit smaller so I can see. When I click on the plus button, you can see also, as we did earlier, we binded this number to item count. And if I scroll down, it's specific to each one, right? So this one's 1, this one's 2, 0. We can make changes to each individual item. So that's working, which is great. All right, so now that we've done that, we probably want to do some more things here. For instance, with this little basket icon we have at the top, you'll see here, we have two different variants. We have one for if the basket is empty, we're not going to have that little badge with a number. And then when there are items added to a cart, we want to display that total number of items here. We already connected this piece of text to the variable cart count, but now we want the particular variant displayed to be influenced by whether or not we've actually added some items. So you'll notice, actually, if we look here, the variant properties are named true and false. And that's because I want to bind them to a Boolean variable. Earlier, we created that Boolean variable called is empty. And that is how we keep track of whether or not the cart is empty or not. So by default, it's true, because by default, we don't want users to have a pre-populated cart. And so what we want to do is basically have, when someone is adding items to their basket, we want to update the is empty Boolean, and then we want that to influence which variable is being displayed for our basket icon. So the first thing for that we need to do is, once again, add some set variable interactions to this button that will update the is empty variable. So let's go back to this interaction we have here, and we'll say on click, we'll set the variable is empty to true, because basically in any case, when you're clicking the plus button, no matter what, that is always going to mean that is empty, is false. Let's set that to false, because we've already added an item just by clicking on this button. For the minus, that really depends, right? I mean, you could have any number of items added. So clicking that minus button could possibly remove the last item, or it could not. So that is going to call for another conditional. And we'll say in this case, if, actually in this case, we'll also need to keep track of something else. Is empty is going to be influenced by cart count. So I'm going to also add that interaction as well. Cart count is essentially our tracking number for the total number of items added to a cart. So first, let's actually add this interaction in as well. So let's do on click, add another set variable, and cart count will be cart count plus 1. And let's bring that above. Okay, so when you click on the plus button, you're adding 1 to that specific item. You're adding 1 to the total number of items being tracked, and then we're updating the is empty. Okay, going back to clicking the minus button, we'll add set variable cart count to cart count minus 1. Actually, we need to make this a conditional as well. So if item count is greater than 0, then we'll set the variable cart count to cart count minus 1. Let's see here. Yes. Otherwise, set variable cart count to, actually, we actually don't need to complete any other kind of action here. Okay, let's remove this extra one. Okay, so if you click on the minus button, depending on if it's greater than 0, we'll subtract 1. Otherwise, we'll set that to 0 because that's the only possible minimum. And then we're going to update the cart count as well, based on if the item count is greater than 0. Okay. And let's actually move this above, because I don't want the item count to be already set to 0 before that. So this is kind of the case here where we're using multiple actions, right? When I'm clicking on the plus or minus button, that is going to essentially have one interaction trigger multiple actions. And in the case of multiple actions, order really matters, especially when I am using an existing variable that is being updated to influence another variable. You really need to think about what order you want these things to run in, because in Figma, it's going to run from top down. So first, I think I'm going to just update cart count, and then I'm going to check item count and see, okay, do I need to subtract 1 or do I just need to set it to 0? Okay, and we don't really need an else. Sometimes for conditionals, you don't necessarily need an else statement. So if not, just don't add an action to that. Okay, we've updated cart count and item count, and then now we need to check for is empty. And basically is empty is going to be cart count is empty is going to be true if cart count is less than or equal to 0. So this is an example of using a Boolean expression for setting a Boolean variable. If this statement, cart count is less than or equal to 0, is true, then is empty is going to be true. If this statement returns false, then it's going to set this variable to false. I could have used a conditional to write this. I could have said, if cart count is less than or equal to 0, set variable is empty to false, else set to true. But this is a much shorter way of doing that. So when you're building your advanced prototypes, you're probably going to notice that there's multiple ways to build essentially the same interaction. But yeah, just really think about which one might be just like the fastest or most convenient way to do that. I think especially in the case of setting a Boolean variable, using Boolean expressions over conditionals is ideal for that reason. Okay, so we've updated this cart count, which then updates the is empty. So we're essentially checking if the cart is in fact empty. And then now we're going to select this basket icon instance, and we're going to bind that to the is empty Boolean. So click on this little assign variable and select the is empty. So if is empty is true or false, because we have our variants named true and false, it is going to essentially assign or display the corresponding variant based on that variable. And that's without even having to use any kind of like set variable interaction. Okay, so we've done that. Let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to clip this content so that the scroll is working properly. Okay, and let's preview this. Okay, so I'm adding, you can see when I added one item for watermelon, it's gone ahead and displayed the basket icon with the badge. If I keep adding, it's going to keep updating this number because this number is connected to that cart count variable. And if I keep adding across different items, you'll see it'll continue to update. So that is working pretty well. Okay, so we basically set up all of the interactions that we need for our product screen. And now we need to make updates to the corresponding basket screen. If I click right now on the basket icon to navigate there, you'll see we can see all of the items. We can see the number of them that have been added in their information here. But it doesn't really make sense, right, to show pears or radishes if they haven't in fact been added to the basket. And we also still have this empty state message that needs to be displayed depending on if the cart is actually empty or not. So let's first connect each of these items to a Boolean variable so that we're able to selectively show whichever ones have been added to the basket. As we stated earlier, to keep track of that, I've created a Boolean variable called added, which will essentially be used to keep track of each item and be used to toggle the visibility of them in the basket screen. So we're going to connect each of these to that. I'm just going to select on each card, go to the layer portion, right click on the eye icon and select added. And I'm basically going to do that for every single one of these. So click on pairs. And you'll also notice that they're disappearing. And that's because the default that I have for this variable is false. So it's going to just by default hide these. Oops, let's do that. Okay. All right, so they're all hidden. And in order for us to actually have this work, we also need to update added for each item when we're interacting with that button. So again, we're going to add an additional interaction to the same button where we will create a set variable added to true. So when you click the plus button, we know for sure that this item is being added. And then here, we'll create a conditional where we're saying, actually, we don't need a conditional. Let's do a Boolean expression because that's much faster. Sometimes I kind of catch myself wanting to default do conditional because I think Boolean expressions are much more foreign to people who are designing and haven't really had much coding experience. But I'm trying to force myself to be more familiar with that. So we'll do set variable added to item count is greater than 0. So if the item count for this item is greater than 0, we know for sure it's added. So that's true. If not, then it is false. Okay, so we've added that interaction to update the added Boolean variable. We've connected our basket items cards to that variable. So let's once again preview the prototype and see how this is working. Okay, so I've added 2 watermelons. Let's click here. Oh, looks like the radishes one is not working. So let's double check that. Okay, I've got the radishes and let's connect to added. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, and we only see watermelons. All right, so next step is for this empty state message. We only want to display that when the cart is empty. So we're going to connect this one's layer visibility by right clicking on the eye icon to the is empty Boolean variable. So we'll select that. And we already have the prototyping interaction set up so that every time you click on the plus or minus button, it's going to update is empty. So let's quickly check and see if this is working. Once again, play. Haven't added anything. Let's click on the basket icon and you can see we just have the empty state. Okay, let's add something. And now you only see the item that's been added. All right, so one last thing that we have to do now is we want the total of the items in the cart to be displayed here. To do that, we're going to have to essentially calculate the total every time you click on a plus or minus side of that button component. So let's first connect this variable to this text to the variable total. So let's connect that. And let's add the prototyping interaction to calculate the total. I'll click on the plus button and let's add an additional interaction. So set variable total to, and so basically for total, we're going to have to multiply each item's count by its price and then add all of those together. With numerical operations in Figma, it's going to operate in the correct order, right? So if you learned about like PEMDAS in school, it's going to do any kind of multiplication and division before addition and subtraction. So I'm going to do item count times price, and I'll do enough of these for each of our items. Okay. And to select the specific variable for a mode, click again on it and you can see we have our modes here. So we'll assign this to the item count watermelon, multiply that by the watermelon price. And we'll basically just go through and select for each one. Yeah. So yeah, now we're setting the total to the item count times price for all the different items added together. And we'll do the exact same thing for the minus button. So add a set variable total to, and just being able to like quickly type things in and hit enter is just incredibly helpful, I think, for building your prototypes a lot faster. Okay, let's quickly set this up. Alrighty. Okay, so every time a user clicks on these buttons, it should recalculate the total. Also, it is very important that we're setting this calculation at the end because we are making updates to that item count variable. We obviously don't want that to happen after calculating the total because otherwise the item count used in this calculation won't be accurate. Okay, so we set that up and let's go ahead and test this out again. So let's add a couple of different items here. Okay, these three are displayed and the total is reflecting that. And yeah, that's basically how you build this entire prototype. Just as a quick reiteration of what are essentially all of the things that we covered. So we talked about how to use modes to group your variables, right? So we have each mode assigned to a different item, and then we have our variables, which are consistent across them, right? So we have a name, price, item count, etc. for each of these items. We learned about how to use variables to carry state across frames. So as you added items in the product screen, those were reflected in the basket screen. We also talked about how to assign visibility of your layers to Boolean variables. So with the empty state, which with each of the card elements, those were connected to Boolean variables. So we made sure that the correct information was in fact displayed at the basket screen. And then we also talked about how to use expressions and conditionals and set variable actions to, when you're clicking on the plus or minus side of the button icon, to make updates to the corresponding variables. So yeah, that's kind of like how we've been able to bring everything together. Oh, and then one other thing that we covered as well was connecting your variant instance to variables. So essentially using your variables to influence which variant is being displayed in your design. All right, so kind of with everything that we've had covered, I want to use like the remaining 10 minutes for a Q&A to answer people's questions and hopefully unblock people as much as possible. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have people on my team who are moderating and they're going ahead and adding these in. So yeah, first question, let's go in present mode here. Can variables be shared between files, or do we have to generate them locally within each file? So variables can be published. And so yeah, it does not have to be local. I think it really depends on if it's something that you think is of value for other people to use. So similar to how you would think about components, right? People create components local to a file because some people just build faster and easier with components. So yeah, I would use that same kind of mentality. It could be local, or you can publish it out for other people to use. It just really depends on if it's something that you think others would find useful. All right. For a design system, as it relates to variables for prototyping, are there any guidelines or best practices for what should live at the design system level versus individual design file level? This is a good question. I think that the use case of variables for design systems and prototyping can be very different. So for design systems, you're going to use variables for a lot of things like standardizing spacing and your colors, and maybe even things like your corner radius and stroke values for your button components, like all that kind of stuff, which doesn't really apply to prototyping. In the context of prototyping, you're using your interactions via the set variable action with expressions and your conditional action to make changes to a variable. So I would actually say that the use case of variables between design systems and prototyping is very different. Unless if maybe you wanted to do something like, for instance, with a button interaction, maybe when you click on it, that's actually going to change some variable connected to a button's like color or stroke. In that case, there could be some overlap, but I think they're very separate as well. It just somehow is a system that works very well both for these two seemingly very separate use cases. But I don't really think there's any one right way to do anything. I feel like my team always says it depends. So yeah, I think it like at the same way, it depends. What works for one team doesn't work for the other. I think also when you're thinking around standardization, always trying to optimize for what allows your team to work faster. We've had some conversations internally just about like, to what degree should we recommend people use variables in prototyping? I think there's always an extreme to where you might use it so much that it actually kind of hurts your team in some ways and can slow you down. So I think it's also very much about finding the right balance on what works for you, as to, yeah, how much you want to define variables and how much you want things to be published out for everyone to use versus like file specific. So yeah, unfortunately, no straight answer, but also always appreciative to kind of like hear, what use cases you guys come up with or specific questions that come up as everyone continues to learn more about variables and use them in prototyping.
Hey, Anna, do you mind if I hop in on this one too as well?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, everyone. Anthony, also from the Designer Advocates team. Anna, that was incredible. I am actually learning so much myself, which is fantastic. I think one good rule of thumb that we do use for these kinds of scenarios is what are the separations of concerns that are most important to your team and who's going to be using these libraries, right? Like remember, one of the reasons why you might break out, say, your brand primitives from your web components or your mobile components or something like that would be that there might be multiple teams that need access to the brand elements, but they don't need, the primitives, but they don't necessarily need access to the web components and things like that, right? So you may find yourself in a similar scenario where some folks do need access to variables from a perspective of theming and tokens and things like that, but may not necessarily need the prototyping variables in that same collection. So you might decide to break them out in that case.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. Yeah. Also, I know there's some people on my team who've like hopped in as panelists. So also, if you guys want to speak up or add anything, feel free to hop in. Next question. Can variables be created via an API, or do we need to hard code all of the values? I'm actually not entirely sure. I'm still getting familiar with variables in the context of just how exactly to migrate your team to variables. So if anyone has a good answer for this,
Yeah, I'm
that'd be
happy to
helpful.
hop in. Obviously, if anyone else on the team wants to hop in. So there is a REST API for both reading and writing variables. This is available on the enterprise plan, so you'll have to make sure that you have that plan's access. What this allows you to do is write those variables directly from whatever source that you may also have. Keep in mind that if you're using this within the context of, say, a design system or something that is a published team library, you do have that secondary check of you can write the variables to the file. That won't immediately distribute them out via your team library. You would have a moment to check all of that work within your library file before you publish that out to the rest of the team as well. And John Kaplan actually posted the documentation link right in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. Thank you, John. Okay, any hints as to when we'll be able to add completely editable input fields into prototypes? I don't think there's like a specific date I can give you guys. It's definitely a piece of feedback we've been getting a lot following up advanced prototyping. So something that our team is aware is a huge priority for our community. So yeah, hopefully something that we can support soon. Can I use prototyping variables inside interactive components and publish them as part of a library and have them work as expected? Also, hi, Mihai. It's nice to see you. So yes, you can connect your variables to your interactive components. And yeah, you can definitely publish your variables as part of your library. In terms of have them work as expected, I think if you're coming across any issues with usability, definitely reach out to our team. Would love to know if you're experiencing any issues with that. But yes, you can publish out your variables, connect it to your components with your libraries and have other people use them. Also, just as a note, anytime you're copying and pasting, like even a non-published design element that has a variable attached to it to another file, it will still have essentially like, it'll basically also copy and paste that variable into the file as well. It won't be listed as a local variable, but there's still like a level of connection that can be retained there, even if things aren't formally published as well. Okay, might have time for just a couple more questions. Can we stack multiple if-else statements under a single interaction? So you can have multiple conditionals for an interaction, but we don't, I think maybe what you're asking is about like, yeah, John says yes, but I think also if you're thinking of potentially like that nested part, which I know you can definitely do in code, we don't have that yet, but if that is something of interest, would definitely love to hear people's thoughts or like use cases around it. But yeah, you can have essentially as many actions as you want if those are set variable, if those are conditionals. Yeah. Okay. For the Boolean set variable, how do you know if it's setting to true or false? I think you're meaning this from like a Boolean expression, which we used in our example. So by default, when you create a variable, you set its value. So first of all, when you create a Boolean variable, you can set that by default to be true or false. And then when it comes to making changes to that, in a prototyping interaction, you could do something super direct, like you could say, just set variable to true or set variable to false. Or you could use expressions and conditionals to make that update. An example that we had that we made together, what I was doing for the layer visibility of each item in the basket is I was saying, okay, if item count is greater than 0, then set added to true. Basically, with Boolean expressions, if something is true, like whatever that statement returns, if it is true or if it is false, that's what it's going to set the Boolean variable to. You could even think of it in terms of like mathematical expressions, right? Like if I said, if 2 plus 2, if I said like set this Boolean variable to 2 plus 2 equals 4, because 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a true statement, it would set that variable to true. If I'd said something like set it to 2 plus 2 equals 5, that's false. So it would set that variable to false. So yeah, I know personally, I find it kind of hard to wrap my mind around Boolean expressions because it's a different way of thinking about logic. But I hope that was helpful. And yeah, always feel free to revisit the file and this recording to kind of see how we use Boolean expressions in action. All right, that is kind of all the time that we have because we're at 10 right now. But thank you guys so much for joining. If you want to check out any future live streams, just go to figma.com/events. And if you have any additional suggestions or ideas, feel free to shoot us an email at community@figma.com. But thank you guys so much for coming. I really hope this was helpful. And yeah, we'll have the recording out as soon as possible. So thank you.